Louisiana, 1944. The Mississippi River shimmered under the early morning sun, its waters carrying mist that clung to the edges of the levees. Trains rattled across iron bridges, and the distant sound of a steamboat horn cut through the air, low and mournful. In one of those trains sat a group of German prisoners, young men taken from the front lines in France and Italy. Among them, 21-year-old Klaus Weber, a wiry soldier from Dresden, clutched the wooden slats of his crate-like carriage, imagining chains, guard dogs, and endless hours under the sun. He had believed the stories his officers whispered about America, a land of violence, greed, and cruelty. Rumors told of POWs starved, beaten, and left to rot far from home. The train screeched to a halt near Alexandria. Dust rose like a curtain, coating the leather of their boots and the folds of their worn uniforms. Klaus peered through the barred windows, expecting soldiers in steel helmets, rifles poised, barking orders. Instead, he saw men in soft felt hats, denim overalls streaked with grease and mud, standing casually by pickup trucks. Their hands rested on fences, on saddles, on nothing at all. The sunlight gleamed off brass buckles and the gleam of polished boots, but there was no menace in the air, only a kind of easy confidence he had never known. The doors opened. The men stepped down, hesitant, awkward, every movement a mixture of fear and instinct. They were herded not into cells, but toward wide-open fields dotted with horses and cattle. From a distance, a trumpet sounded, brassy, bold, unfamiliar. The tune rolled over the flat, humid land. It carried with it something Klaus did not recognize: freedom. An older man with a soft voice and broad shoulders approached, tipping his hat. "Morning, gentlemen. Y'all ready to work?" He smiled, and for the first time since capture, Klaus felt a flicker of confusion. There were no guards, no dogs, no shouts. Only the smell of hay, fresh earth, and the warm, strange comfort of sunlight on his face. They were assigned to Camp Ruston first, a sprawling POW facility built in the piney woods of northern Louisiana. Rows of wooden barracks stretched like a regimented army of rectangles. But here, order did not come from fear. It came from routine, from structure, from a strange American logic that balanced discipline with decency. Klaus observed the camp as they were escorted to their quarters. The men were offered food, hot biscuits, bacon, coffee steaming in tin cups. They were allowed to write letters, play cards, and for some, attend classes to learn English. Yet the greatest surprise waited beyond the gates. From the nearby town came the sound of music: jazz, trumpets, clarinets, and drums that danced in a rhythm unlike anything Klaus had ever heard. Soldiers laughed in the streets, women tapped their heels, and somewhere a piano rolled out notes that vibrated through the humid air. The prisoners froze, their minds struggling to reconcile this melody with the monster they had been told awaited them. Klaus's curiosity drew him closer. He stood at the edge of the town square, watching locals pour from storefronts, carrying groceries, nodding at the soldiers, tipping their hats. No one demanded obedience. No one treated him as less than human. The music swirled, weaving through his mind, and for the first time, he imagined that the world might hold something other than war and fear. Days passed. Klaus and the others were put to work on farms and ranches. They learned to feed livestock, repair fences, and handle machinery. American overseers, ranchers and farmers alike, guided them patiently. When Klaus first mounted a horse, he almost fell, tangled in the stirrups, heart racing. Yet the ranchers did not scold. They laughed softly, steadying him, teaching him to feel the rhythm of the animal beneath him. Each movement became a lesson not only in skill, but in trust. Here, responsibility was shared, not enforced. Evenings brought the music back. From makeshift stages and open-air bars, jazz spilled into the night, bold and irrepressible. The prisoners listened, captivated. At first, Klaus felt an odd shame. How could they enjoy such beauty when their homeland was at war, when friends and family suffered? But the music persisted, and so did the Americans' quiet kindness. Slowly, resistance gave way to wonder. He began humming along, tapping his boots, letting the syncopated rhythms flow through him. Letters home became chronicles of astonishment. "We were told we would be beaten, starved, and left to die," Klaus wrote, But here we are fed, clothed, and allowed to learn. The music, it shakes the soul, and yet it does not lie. The Americans, they do not hate us. Perhaps they never did censors read the letters and smiled faintly at the disbelief on the other side of the Atlantic. To the German families, these words sounded impossible. Too kind, too generous, too American. Life at Camp Ruston and nearby facilities like Camp Livingston moved on in this rhythm. Work by day, music by night, and a slow, inexorable unraveling of fear and indoctrination. German prisoners discovered skills and freedoms they had never imagined. They learned to handle jazz instruments, to dance to new rhythms, to speak and laugh with men and women they had been taught to despise. Slowly, the walls in their minds began to crumble. One afternoon, a storm rolled in across the flat Louisiana plains. Rain poured in sheets, lightning split the sky, and the cattle panicked. Klaus, now confident on his horse, rode alongside the Americans, guiding the animals back to safety. The sound of thunder could not drown the laughter and shouted encouragement as prisoners and ranchers worked together. By the end of the storm, soaked and mud-splattered, Klaus realized that courage and trust had nothing to do with fear. They had everything to do with respect, patience, and humanity. As months passed, the war in Europe reached its final days. News arrived through radios and letters. Germany was collapsing, surrender imminent. Klaus and his comrades listened, silent and uncertain. The war that had defined their lives was ending, yet they had been living another kind of war here, a battle against hatred, ignorance, and fear. And in this unexpected corner of Louisiana, they had begun to lose that battle. Repatriation arrived slowly. Trucks carried prisoners back to staging areas for transport across the Atlantic. Americans waved, tipped hats, and offered small gifts: a harmonica, a tin of chocolate, a Stetson hat. Klaus clasped the hat to his chest, eyes brimming, understanding fully that these gestures were more than kindness. They were the language of a nation confident enough to heal through humanity. When he finally returned to Dresden in the winter of 1945, Klaus found ruins, ash, and grief. Yet he carried with him the memory of jazz, open fields, and the strange dignity of being trusted. It was a lesson invisible to maps and monuments, yet unshakable in the heart. He would tell stories to friends, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen, of music that awakened the soul, of Americans who treated captives with respect, of a small town in Louisiana that taught a young German soldier the quiet, unyielding power of freedom and mercy. Years later, Klaus would immigrate to the United States, settling in New Orleans, drawn by the music and warmth he had once known as a prisoner. He played jazz himself, sometimes telling audiences, "I learned this when I was a prisoner." Freedom sounds like this. Historians now look back on Louisiana's POW camps as unlikely crucibles of reconciliation, where music, work, and trust reshaped lives more profoundly than any battle could. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield. They are earned in the quiet grace of compassion, in the laughter that bridges enemies, in the music that makes hearts beat in unison, even amidst war. And on the banks of the Mississippi, under the wide Louisiana sky, a young German soldier discovered that true freedom is not only a gift of nations, but a gift of people. One note, one kind word, one shared rhythm at a time. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not won with guns or orders. They are won in jazz notes rising over the humid air, in shared labor under a burning sun, and in the simple act of seeing another human being as equal. And in Louisiana, beneath the sprawling pines and the wide, ever-stretching sky, a group of young German soldiers learned that freedom, dignity, and music can survive even in the shadow of war. The POWs were exposed to another shock: racial complexity. In nearby towns, African-American musicians played in bars and small clubs, their melodies ringing out with improvisation and soul. Klaus and Dieter watched, fascinated, as the locals treated each musician with respect and applause, an order of dignity unfamiliar to men raised under a hierarchy of obedience and segregation. Friedrich whispered complaints at first, angry at the apparent contradiction to the world he knew, but even he could not deny the artistry, the power, and the humanity in those performances. By the summer of 1944, the camp had become a crucible, not only of skill, but of moral awakening. Letters home began to shift in tone, capturing disbelief and awe. "We are treated like men, not enemies," Klaus wrote, "and the music we hear touches a part of the soul I thought had been silenced by war. Americans, they are not monsters. They are something else entirely. They are a nation confident in their humanity." Dieter's letters brimmed with excitement, describing jam sessions with locals, laughter under moonlight, and the thrill of first daring to perform jazz himself. Friedrich's letters were cautious but revealed the slow cracks in his indoctrination, acknowledgement of kindness, an admission that fear was not the only path. As autumn approached, the war in Europe edged closer to its end. Radio broadcasts brought news of D-Day's success, the collapse of German positions, and finally, the surrender in May 1945. The prisoners absorbed the news with muted shock. The ideological world that had once defined them had crumbled even before they stepped back onto German soil. Here in Louisiana, they had learned lessons no war could erase: patience, collaboration, improvisation, and the unexpected power of kindness. Repatriation began. Trucks and trains moved prisoners toward New Orleans, where ships awaited to carry them back to a Germany scarred and broken. Klaus, Dieter, and even Friedrich were given parting gifts: hats, instruments, and small tokens of remembrance. In those final moments, the POWs understood something profound. America had not only held them captive, it had reshaped them. They had left Louisiana with more than memories. They carried a moral education, one that challenged the propaganda they had grown up with, one that questioned obedience, hatred, and fear itself. Years later, Klaus settled in New Orleans, drawn to the jazz clubs, the riverfront, and the city's warm embrace. Dieter followed, opening a small music school, teaching American children the violin and sharing the rhythms he had learned in captivity. Friedrich, initially hesitant, returned to Germany, but carried a copy of a jazz record that he treasured, a reminder that beauty and humanity could survive even in the darkest times. The POW camps in Louisiana were not merely facilities of war. They were laboratories of reconciliation, where the human heart was tested and stretched beyond indoctrination and fear. Historians now see these experiences as critical touchstones. A generation of prisoners returned home with memories that defied hatred, experiences that seeded understanding, and a musical and cultural bridge that outlived the war. The Mississippi sun still rises over Louisiana, and in the rhythm of jazz and the sway of the river, the story endures. Klaus often told his students, "Freedom is not merely the absence of chains. It is the music we make, the hands we extend, and the trust we give." Even enemies, when treated as humans, can learn to hear the same song. And in the quietest moments, when the trumpet calls across the levee and the notes spill into the air like sunlight over the fields, Klaus, Dieter, and even Friedrich would remember the summer of 1944. The summer they were prisoners, yes, but prisoners who discovered something greater than confinement. They discovered rhythm, laughter, trust, and the quiet, enduring power of humanity. The weeks stretched on across the piney Louisiana landscape, and the Mississippi sun grew hotter, pressing down on the thin uniforms of the German prisoners. Klaus Weber had begun to adjust to the rhythm of life at Camp Ruston, but now his world was about to expand in ways he could not have imagined. Among the newly arrived prisoners were Friedrich Braun, a stocky young man from Hamburg with a sharp tongue and suspicion in his eyes, and Dieter Vogel, a wiry musician from Leipzig, carrying with him a battered violin case that seemed to vibrate with quiet longing. Unlike Klaus, who had begun to sense the strange grace of the Americans' treatment, Friedrich arrived hardened, his mind armored against the possibility of kindness. Dieter, however, approached the camp with curiosity and hope, eager for music and small pleasures, like a moth drawn to a distant light. The first morning, the three were assigned to work on a sugarcane plantation near Alexandria. The fields stretched endlessly, green and heavy with dew, shimmering under the heat of the morning sun. Cattle grazed nearby, and the air carried the distant hum of a blues-infused jazz tune from a local town, carried on the wind over miles of flat earth. Klaus led the way, instructing Friedrich and Dieter in the ways of tending the animals, mending fences, and operating the small steam tractors that churned up the rich, wet soil. Friedrich complained bitterly, his voice harsh, comparing the Americans to the monsters he had been told they were. Dieter, meanwhile, whistled along with the music in the distance, his hands moving deftly even when the labor demanded precision and strength. By evening, they were exhausted, sweat mixing with the Louisiana clay, but something remarkable began to happen. The townsfolk had arranged a small gathering in the town hall, a casual celebration for the POWs, honoring their work in the fields and the labor they contributed to the harvest. Klaus, Friedrich, and Dieter arrived cautiously, expecting inspection, rebuke, or ridicule. Instead, they found chairs set in a semicircle, a makeshift stage with a piano, a trumpet, and a double bass, and a crowd of Americans clapping and smiling warmly. The music began with a slow, sultry rhythm. A local band played ragtime infused with the early sounds of jazz, piano keys dancing in sunlight, trumpet calls cutting across the humidity, drums rolling like distant thunder. Klaus felt the vibrations deep in his chest. Friedrich froze, rigid and suspicious, unable to reconcile the sound with his mental image of America. Dieter stepped forward, violin in hand, and allowed the notes to blend tentatively with the rhythm. Within moments, the music became a conversation. German and American, soldier and civilian, laborer and musician, each note bridging the gap of distrust and fear. In the following weeks, the transformation of the prisoners became more apparent. Klaus learned the subtle art of improvisation, following the unpredictable melodies of the locals. Friedrich resisted at first, but he could not deny the rhythm's pull. His fingers tapped unconsciously, his scowl softening. Dieter thrived, his violin becoming a voice that connected the two cultures, drawing laughter and applause alike. The camp had begun to feel less like a holding pen and more like a strange, unplanned academy for humanity. Beyond music, life offered other lessons. The POWs were invited into kitchens to help with preparations for community gatherings, learning recipes for jambalaya, gumbo, and fried catfish. Klaus had never seen such abundance. Spices, fresh vegetables, and rich sauces were foreign luxuries. He watched Dieter carefully fold cornmeal into hot oil, laughing as a misstep sent a small puff of smoke into the air. Friedrich, reluctantly, tasted a spoonful of roux and paused, as if tasting sweetness could be a moral sin. But gradually, even he could not resist the flavor, savoring the richness that defied everything the Reich had told them about American gluttony and cruelty. The night settled soft and heavy over Camp Ruston, a blanket of southern heat draped across the barracks like a secret no wind could lift. Klaus Weber lay awake, listening to the chorus of crickets beyond the wire, each chirp blending with the faint hum of a generator somewhere near the mess hall. He had stopped counting the days. The calendar scratched on the wall no longer marked captivity, only change, small, imperceptible shifts that turned enemies into men who waited for mail and wondered about music. The Americans had brought a radio into the recreation hut 2 weeks earlier. They said it was broken, but one of the guards, a red-haired mechanic from New Orleans, coaxed it back to life with a twist of copper wire and a prayer to St. Anthony. The first sound it made wasn't a voice or static. It was a trumpet, bright and reckless, spilling through the air like a laugh too big for the room. Louis Armstrong, someone whispered. Klaus had never heard the name, but he remembered the feeling. The brass leapt, the drums rolled, and the rhythm made his pulse do something strange, something free. That night replayed in his mind now, long after lights out. Across the aisle, Dieter Krantz snored softly, the rhythm of a man who had long since surrendered his worries to routine. Dieter had been a schoolteacher before the war, fluent in French. Curious about every American word, he claimed jazz was chaos, the sound of people who never learned discipline. But the next morning, Klaus saw his foot tapping under the table at breakfast. Work details had changed too. The guards now led small groups outside the wire to help harvest sugarcane. It was backbreaking, sun-burning labor, but it felt more alive than anything inside the camp. The fields stretched beyond sight, dotted with locals who sang while they worked, songs in English, songs in Creole, songs older than the country itself. Klaus didn't understand the words, yet the melodies settled in him like roots in wet soil. One afternoon, while they rested under a cypress tree, a farmer handed Klaus a tin cup of water and asked in slow English, "You like music?" Klaus hesitated, then nodded. The man smiled. "Then you like Louisiana." Those words echoed louder than the trumpet on the radio. When evening came, the prisoners were marched back under a sky painted in violet and gold. A storm was building far to the south, throwing silent lightning across the clouds. Klaus watched it flash beyond the fence line and thought of the symphonies he had once adored. Beethoven, Wagner, the proud sound of order. Jazz was different. It didn't march, it danced. It didn't demand, it invited. And in that invitation, Klaus felt something loosen that years of propaganda had bound tight. Weeks passed. Camp life followed its rhythm. Roll call, work, letters, meals. Yet inside the dull routine, a quiet revolution stirred. Guards and prisoners began trading words, small gestures, then smiles. Some prisoners of war learned to play baseball. Others painted signs for the local town. And every Saturday, the radio played. The camp's recreation hall became a makeshift theater. Someone painted Ruston Playhouse above the door in crooked letters. Inside, benches faced a stage built from old crates. The Americans let the Germans put on plays to keep morale up, but soon the performances turned musical. Dieter found an old harmonica. Another prisoner, Friedrich Lang, a former apprentice in a Berlin dance band, crafted a drum from a barrel and stretched canvas. The first time they played together, the guards clapped. The second time, they danced. Friedrich was older, sharp-eyed, and quick with jokes that could slice through tension. He'd been skeptical of Louisiana from the start. A land of swamps and ghosts, he'd called it. But the ghosts began to charm him. He talked often of his days playing waltzes in small German cafes, how music had once been escape, not entertainment. Jazz bewildered him. "It breaks all the rules," he said, half admiring, half afraid. "And yet it works." That contradiction fascinated Klaus. He spent evenings watching Friedrich's hands coax rhythm from scraps of metal and wood, amazed at how chaos could form harmony. Slowly, he began to understand. Jazz wasn't disorder. It was freedom disguised as sound. Autumn crept in with golden fields and cooler nights. Rumors of the war's turning reached them in fragments. Normandy, Paris, the fall of Berlin whispered through guarded conversations. The older soldiers stiffened. The younger ones dreamed. What would happen when it ended? Would they return as heroes or ghosts? Klaus didn't know. All he knew was that the world outside their barbed wire was moving forward, and somehow he had already begun to follow. One late evening, a storm broke over Ruston. Rain hammered the tin roofs, and thunder rolled across the bayou. The power flickered, plunging the camp into shadow. Somewhere in the dark, Friedrich started drumming. Slow at first, then louder, faster, echoing the storm's heartbeat. Others joined. Hands clapping, voices humming, boots tapping the floor. The rhythm grew wild, unstoppable. Lightning lit their faces in flashes. Young men, enemies by uniform, bound by music and rain. For a moment, the war disappeared. When the lights returned, even the guards were laughing. One leaned in through the doorway and said, "You boys sound better than the radio." After that night, everything felt different. The fence was still there, the rules unchanged, but the distance between us and them had thinned. Klaus saw it in the way Sergeant O'Neill passed him a cigarette without a word, or how the cook slipped extra bread to the band after they played. Kindness was as contagious as rhythm. December brought rumors of Christmas concerts. The camp commander approved one evening of music shared between POWs and locals. A small stage was built in the mess hall, garlands of pine strung across the beams. The Americans provided instruments, a trumpet, a battered piano, a second-hand saxophone. Friedrich's eyes shone like a child's. "Now," he said, "we make real music." They rehearsed for days, blending German carols with American swing. Klaus learned to keep time on the bass drum. Dieter managed a clarinet squeak that made everyone laugh, and Friedrich led them with the confidence of a man reborn. When the night finally arrived, townsfolk gathered outside the wire. Families, soldiers, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. The guards opened the gate just enough to let the sound pass freely between two worlds. The first notes of Silent Night drifted out, soft and familiar. Then, halfway through, Friedrich grinned and shifted the rhythm. The carol melted into a slow, swaying blues. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then applause, laughter. A trumpet solo soared into the cold air, defying boundaries that no one dared enforce. Even the commander smiled. When the final chord faded, silence hung. Not awkward, but sacred. Then came cheers, hats waved, hands clapping through the fence. For the first time since capture, Klaus felt not imprisoned, but seen. That night, lying in his bunk, he wrote in his journal, words he could never have imagined months before. Music is proof that the world is wider than fear. Winter settled over the pine-lined barracks with a cold, slow insistence, the fog rolling off the Red River carrying the scent of damp earth and distant firewood. Inside the camp, life followed its quiet rhythm. Wake, work, meals, letters, sleep. Yet beneath the routine, subtle transformations rippled like notes in a jazz improvisation. Klaus Weber, Dieter Krantz, and Friedrich Lang had discovered something far more potent than any war strategy: the fragile, undeniable pulse of humanity. Each morning, the fog revealed long shadows of the barracks, and the trio would watch the mist hug the ground as if the world itself had drawn a curtain over them. They rose with the sun now, a habit that felt almost natural. Work details shifted subtly with the seasons. The cane harvest slowed, fields needed tending, and the camp's orchestra rehearsal became a regular ritual. They practiced under flickering lamps, listening to every whisper of rhythm, every brush of cymbals against drumskins. The music became their heartbeat, a language beyond words, beyond orders, beyond fear. Across camp, other prisoners began to notice the shift. Hans Becker, a wiry 19-year-old from Hamburg who had spent most of the war training as a pilot but never flown beyond Germany, started helping Friedrich with percussion. He had no musical background, but the Americans encouraged him, clapping as he tentatively struck each beat. Music, they began to realize, had a way of erasing rank, age, or previous allegiance. Letters arrived from home with increasing frequency, though censored and clipped. Some contained news of family lost, towns burned, or rationing worsening. But the letters also carried disbelief, curiosity, and fear. How could Germany's soldiers be safe, fed, and, in Klaus's words, allowed to dance with brass instruments in their hands? The contrast between what they experienced and what had been drilled into them for years was almost unbearable. And yet, every day, life in Louisiana quietly answered those doubts. The Americans noticed the change too. Guards who had once been distant observers began engaging more, teaching German phrases, swapping recipes, or demonstrating basic steps of swing dancing. One evening, during a frost that bit the exposed fields, a young lieutenant named James Merrick gathered the prisoners and said simply, "We're all just people. Work hard, stay honest, and you'll live better than fear allows." There was no preaching, no moralizing, just practical guidance, a seed of trust sown. By January, snow had briefly dusted the edges of the cane fields. It melted quickly in the southern sun, leaving mud and puddles that clung stubbornly to boots. Klaus, Dieter, Friedrich, and Hans were assigned to deliver firewood to the barracks, hauling bundles through the thickening mud. On the way back, Klaus noticed a small crowd of locals gathering near the fence, families with children, some elderly men leaning on canes, watching quietly. No shouting, no suspicion, only curious eyes. He realized then that this was another lesson in human decency, observation without malice.